Hello and welcome to the next episode of Cylinder Radio. I'm Will Roosh. I am the host of the show, and I'm a high school teacher, high school social studies teacher, trying to bring about nuance in our conversations, but like to touch on education. That's my wheelhouse. And my guest today, I think, can shine some light on some dark spots in education, and that is Connor Boyack. He is the president of Libertas Institute, which is a free market think tank, and the author of the Tuttle Twins books. Connor, thank you so much for being here. You came on my radar from, I was at a friend of mine's house, and the Tuttle Twins books, I remember seeing ads for it. I was like, oh, let me see what this is all about. And it was one, I think it was called like Education Vacation or something. And I
That's
opened it up, I
right.
was like,
Yep.
John Taylor Gatto. I was like, oh, now we're talking. That's my man. I was like, okay, let's see what this is all about. And it was really cool. And I think that there's a real blind spot in my field of education about free market ideas, libertarian ideas, and things like that. And you are kind of that's your wheelhouse of trying to bring more of that. So I'm excited to
Yep.
talk to you today, hear about how you got into it and everything like that. But can you just share with my audience? I know there's a good portion of my audience that's aware of the stuff that you do, but for those that aren't, can you just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about kind of how you ended up here?
Yeah. So I grew up in California. I like to say that I was a refugee leaving the state back when you could find U-Haul trucks to get out of there. So that was quite a while ago.
I'm so here.
I went to public school. Yeah, I went to public school. I never knew any different, and I went to college and didn't like learning. In fact, there were three topics that I did the worst in, and it was history, economics, which was more like high school and then college, and English. And what's hilarious is now I've written 36 books. I've built economic curriculum. I just wrote a history book. It's like now that topics I'm passionate about, and you might say somewhat of an expert in, I hated in school and really struggled with. And so my schooling experience was not a positive one. Certainly from the social side, it was fine, but I spent my kind of young adult years lamenting how far behind I was and how much I really didn't like how I was taught and how I learned. So I later in life, through a long series of events, ended up starting a nonprofit, Libertas Institute. We are what's called a think tank, which means we sit around coming up with strategies and plans to change laws in a more free market direction, get the government to repeal laws, restrict its power so that we can have more freedom. We've changed over 100 laws. We now work across the country. Many of the laws we passed are the first of their kind in the entire country. And so then when my kids were young, they would ask me, I would ask them, how was your day? What did you do? And my 5-year-old at the time started asking me, Dad, what did you do today? And I'm like, typed on a computer. Like, how do you explain to a 5-year-old that you fought eminent domain, at the local city council? Or like, how do you boil this down? So I went on Amazon. I'm looking for books to help me talk to my kids about these ideas, property rights, free markets, and all the rest. There was nothing. That prompted this idea that became the Tuttle Twins with my partner Elijah, who's our illustrator. And so now we've sold millions of books. We got a cartoon, a podcast, all kinds of stuff, really trying to lean into this idea of kids are not being taught these ideas of a free society. If anything, they're being taught quite opposite ideas today. Let's step into that void and empower families to be able to talk about these ideas together around the dinner table, recognizing that teachers and TikTok and all the rest are talking about quite opposite things. Let's counter that and give these families a resource to talk to their kids about ideas they believe in.
Wow. It's interesting how I have a very similar past where I didn't like school and I kept thinking like, but knowing things is cool, being capable is cool. So why is the institution that's supposed to make you that thing not? What's not the connection? My whole life is now in education. I despise school and really struggled with just connecting it. So it's interesting. And then now that's what you do, and this is what I do. Um, I agree with you that there is not good education about what is actually constitutional, what is about your rights and responsibilities of being a citizen. That's why I teach civics. Like, why do you think that is? Why do you think it is that so many people in my field, I don't know how many K through 12 teachers, high school teachers, reach out to you to say like, man, I really love what you're doing. I'm guessing not enough. And I'm wondering,
Sure.
I'm sure there's
Yeah.
some, but not enough. Like, why do you think that is? I have my own theories, but I want to pick your brain on this.
So I agree with you. There's definitely not enough. We do hear from the lone voices in the wilderness who, like parched drop of water on parched lips. You know, they're like, oh, I found something that can help me. This is wonderful. People who think like me. Yeah, there's not enough. And I mean, we can look at this from the angle of the teacher training colleges and the people who are primarily attracted to the profession. And it's a very authoritarian, kind of paternalistic approach. You know, very few entrepreneurial people are gravitating towards and being attracted by that system. And it's kind of increasingly gone in that direction. So we can look at it from that vantage point. We could look at it from the history of public school and say, like, I was speaking to a parents group recently, and this mom was venting about how public schools are broken was the term that she used. And I respectfully, I said, hang on, I completely disagree with you. I think they are doing exactly as intended by the people who created the system. When you look at Horace Mann and like Horace Mann has this quote where he says, men are cast iron, children are like wax. Like, these people recognize that the children are these malleable, individuals who can be shaped into what they want. And when you look at John Dewey and Goodlad and others, like, they didn't want entrepreneurial, critically thinking, independent minded people. They wanted to subordinate these people in this Prussian model to have them be very good at following orders and moving one widget from this conveyor belt to that conveyor belt, doing what they were told. And that was the vision of what they wanted, was this homogenized, collectivized society, not these highly individualistic people each kind of forging their own path. So I look at this from the vantage point of why are so few teachers thinking like you are, acting like you are? Why did John Taylor Gatto, despite his 30 years of effort in the school system, ultimately quit, writing his op-ed in the Wall Street Journal saying, I quit, I think? And he goes on to explain how he was ultimately hurting kids more than he was helping them, despite trying to innovate from within the system, because the system was designed so heavily to snuff out curiosity and innovation. So it is hard. I mean, I feel like we need. It's also then kind of this self-perpetuating vicious cycle where the good teachers are often driven out of the highly bureaucratic system, which means that those left behind are increasingly the kind that either tolerate or thrive on that bureaucracy and authoritarianism. And so you create this vicious spiraling cycle. We see this, I think, with law enforcement too. Like, I know a lot of people who are like, man, this is ridiculous, I'm out of here. So increasingly the people left in positions of authority in legislatures and police and these systems of power are the very people who should not be having access to those levers of power. And so it creates even further problems that I think we're seeing today. So lots of angles to kind of approach this conversation from, but I think fundamentally the people attracted to the profession are unfortunately the type of people that I don't want talking to my children, and that's unfortunate. But I'm also very optimistic because I think, especially as a result of COVID, we've seen this explosion of alternatives and innovation, and this eye-opening recognition from a lot of parents that there are a lot of ways to educate your children. It doesn't need to be like, my mom to this day apologizes that she didn't homeschool me because it wasn't a thing back in the 80s and 90s in California. That was like the weird kids on the compound, in the city next to you. And like, it just culturally, it wasn't a thing. That has totally changed. And I'm also hopeful, skeptically so, that explosion of competition, the micro schools, the pandemic pods, the tripling of homeschooling across the country is going to add a little bit of competitive pressure to the public schools to say, like, hey, maybe we ought to rethink and do things differently. I'm skeptical, as I said, I don't know, but I'm overall optimistic that parents are seeing that there are more than one way to educate your kids, and there's lots of opportunities now.
Yeah, no, I agree with you completely, and I've seen the same thing. I had Royal Ellis on my podcast. He's a black police officer, a LA police officer, but he left. And he said the same thing. He's like, the system's not broken. It's the exact same words. I see this over. I talk about it because I teach government. I'm like, I think a lot of people probably get into politics like, I'm going to go change the world. I'm going to go make good things happen. And the system's so corrupt. I heard Tulsi Gabbard talking once about her first day on the job. They separated Democrats and Republicans. They said, your goal is to get wins. And she's like, excuse me, isn't it to serve the American people? They're like, oh, no. Oh, new freshman. No. It's like, so there's these things that are built up, and you're just once you're in it, it's like the David Foster Wallace thing. Like, once you're in the water, you don't even notice that there's water around. And I think that's a real problem when it comes to education and teaching kids, because then I always say the exchange in schooling, like I have a 5, a 7, and then a 1-year-old, but my kids are very curious because they're at that age where they just are starting to get into school. But schools exchange that curiosity for compliance, because what makes a good student? One who does what they're told. But it doesn't teach entrepreneurship. And I didn't know anything other until I married my wife, who's an immigrant from the Philippines, came here, and she's a real entrepreneur. It's just like go-getter. And she didn't go to college, and she struggled in high school, and yet she's very successful. So to let kids know that there's other alternatives, but also the reality of the way the Constitution is written. I mean, it's fascinating how people don't understand about what your rights are. And that's something that's really important for you and in your work, is just like, you should know what you're entitled to, but then there always is that flip side, which I do want to get to, of if you have rights. We've been focusing on rights for a long time because of like civil rights movement and stuff like that. But then what we haven't focused on is your responsibility with those rights. If you have the right to do all of these things, you have the right to be an a-hole then, but what is your responsibility? So how do you reconcile that? Because if you tell young people like you are actually entitled to do a lot more than you think you are, you have to couple that, right, with like, and you need some sort of moral compass for deciding what to do with all of those freedoms.
This is actually the question I thought you were going to ask previously, which is like, why aren't these schools teaching about rights in the Constitution, and like, what do you think it is about these schools that why kids aren't being taught the right way? And I have a very simple answer for that. I mean, maybe I'll put my tinfoil hat on for a minute, but I really don't think that government schools have the inherent interest in teaching people what their rights are, the dangers of government, how government violates those rights, how historically the greatest purveyor of violating people's rights is not random thugs and gangsters, and like, it's the governments themselves. I mean, you mentioned your wife from the Philippines. I just got done reading this fantastic book called How to Hide an Empire. Amazing book. It is so rare these days where I read a history book that I'm not like gobsmacked with. Like, okay, it's like, oh, I didn't know that. Okay, interesting tidbit or whatever. This book, I'm flipping its page. Like, I had no idea the history of the Philippines, and the absolute barbarity of the United States government in the Philippines. Like, people often talk about the Civil War as like the most bloody, American war, like pales in comparison to what the United States government did in the Philippines. And so I'm reading this and I'm like, oh my gosh, like, how did I never learn this stuff before? I was never taught this. So I don't think that government schools have any type of incentive to help us understand what our rights are. Ultimately, I think those in power thrive off of ignorance, and that is the perverse incentive whereby public, like John Taylor Gatto, he called it dumbing us down. His book was titled "Dumbing Us Down: The Hidden Curriculum of Compulsory Education." I think that the incentive is in the reverse. Those in power prefer a people who are ignorant. Why? Because, as Horace Mann said, then you're malleable. It's easy to manipulate people who don't know their rights. If we aren't even aware that this ideological battle is happening around us, that there are people in power who are trying to oppress us and chip away at our rights, we've already lost if we don't even know the battle is happening. And so think of it this way: 40 years ago, next year, 1983, there was a National Commission on Excellence in Education put together with the Reagan administration, and they got all these stakeholders and expert people and whatever, and they did this 18-month review, and they looked at schools and curriculum and teachers and the whole profession to kind of analyze across the country, how are we doing overall with education. Keep in mind, this is 40 years ago, and here's this snippet from their report that they issued in response. The educational foundations of our society are presently being eroded by a rising tide of mediocrity that threatens our very future as a nation and as a people. If an unfriendly foreign power had attempted to impose on America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we might well have viewed it as an act of war. As it stands, we have allowed this to happen to ourselves. So I look at that and I say, if that was 40 years ago, which I don't think they were wrong, what terminology would, if it was a rising tide of mediocrity 4 decades ago when I was barely born, what terminology would we use to describe what it is today? And again, like, I think the system isn't broken. I think the system is doing what its creators and many intend. That's not to say teachers sign up like you who want to help kids and inspire and teach. Like, I don't think hardly any teacher has that aspiration to help suppress the curiosity of children, but they find themselves being absorbed into this Borg-like, collective that resistance is futile, and now we're all automatons in this collective of no individual identity. So I think those in power prefer the way it is. They like that there's civic illiteracy. They like seeing those videos of like jaywalking back in the day, but you can see them on YouTube. You go ask a kid, who's the president today, or what are the three branches of government, and they don't know, right? And we laugh and we bemoan that, oh my gosh, what a failure. But I think ultimately those in power are completely okay with it because it serves their purposes and it allows them to continue to dominate and manipulate us. So if we want something different, and if we don't want, their same goals and ends, we have to reject and either reform or reject or compete against or pursue some other course, because the status quo is not working for us. It is working for them, and we can't rely ultimately, I think, on government institutions to teach us the dangers of government. And I think what we see right now is exhibit A of that.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. And when you say like put on the tinfoil hat, I say that all the time. Like people say, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. Like, I'm a history teacher, actually, but it can sometimes look the same. But like, if you think about it, like just from the basic ideas, I say like a corporation's job is to raise shareholder value. You can't blame that. Like, if someone wanted to come along, they say, you know what, I'm doing a free enterprise children's series called the Jenkins Twins, and it's a ripoff kind of what you're doing, and they're promoting, and they have a whole bunch of memes. They're a wealthy person that can put out this meme. You're going to be like, hey, F you. Like, no, like, I'm going to try and shut that down a little bit. I'm going to try and shut that down because you're trying to take from my family. You're trying to take stuff off of their plate. Like, it's a very natural thing to a degree. Like, that's part of competition. And the problem is when it's the government that is involved in this competition, then they would act just like any corporation would. But the corporations now, I think there's a lot of, kind of going off on a tangent a little bit, but I think there's a lot of regulatory capture. I think that what's happening is, if we are going to be a free market, okay, then what there's too much resources going to things like the pharmaceutical industry, the insurance companies, all these different corporations that are then going over, and they're funding like some crazy percentage of the CDC's funding comes from big pharma. Like, it's absurd. It's unbelievable. The SEC is completely raptured with Janet Yellen. She has, spoken at Goldman Sachs for hundreds of thousands of dollars per hour. Like, this is unbelievable. So it's what we have now is just corporate competition using the government as a tool to suppress the other ones. Like, if you were if the Jenkins Twins came out and you had a lot of connections to senators and stuff, you could push some sort of non-compete or something like that to support your business. And you might do that because you believe that you are doing the right thing, and you have to look out for your family and all that kind of stuff. When you break it down that way, I think it's actually not absurd to think that that's the way that all this kind of stuff works. I think about that even with like wild stuff like Jeffrey Epstein, and I'm like, look, you probably had a pedophile in your neighborhood and your parents were like, stay away from old man Smith's house because he might touch you. But if he was a billionaire, he would have all of these resources to cover up his terrible actions. And I think that when we pull it apart like that, it's not as tinfoil hattish as it might sound. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
If anything, it's human behavior. It's incentives. We all have incentives, right? And so, in a sense, it's natural and it's understandable. We have to recognize that these things exist. And so that, I think, is why, as history teachers, we talk about the historical dangers of the centralization of power. It's why the founding fathers wanted to decentralize power, pull it down, as Jefferson said, chain them down with the Constitution, right? Because they saw, in Greece and Rome and elsewhere, how when power is centralized in one person or in one body, right, tyranny ultimately ensues, because they are humans and they will operate in a way to maintain and augment their power, just as I want to maintain and augment my market share of Tuttle Twins to compete against the Jenkins Twins, right? I am naturally incentivized to do what I can to defeat the other guy. And so that is why when we centralize power in DC and in the executive, it becomes such a danger. But again, that's not really in the curriculum. I mean, you open these history books and it's like, FDR was great. He saved us from the Depression, right? And we're not talking about current events. We're not analyzing okay, let's talk about the filibuster. Let's talk about how it was Harry Reid who changed the filibuster, and now the Democrats, you know, if they're in the losing party, or then everyone's bemoaning the other. It's like, well, wait a minute, why don't we listen to, I think it was Lincoln who said, never give your friend a power you wouldn't want your enemy to have. And so these politically expedient things operating based on those incentives and that behavior, hey, we're going to do this to get what we want. But then when we're in the minority, now we're going to decry, like, oh, that horrible corruption, you shouldn't be, you know, using this to steamroll what you want. And so to me, it's just such it's ignorance. It is the quote we all know, but all suck at doing anything about. Those who don't learn from the past are condemned to repeat it. History does not necessarily repeat itself, but there are echoes, there are cycles, there are definitely
Right.
patterns. And so, yeah, very much so. And so it's like we talk about that quote all the time, but my biggest beef with social studies and American history in schools today is that we're not at all teaching kids to learn from the past. We are simply teaching kids about the past. It's like we're walking them through this museum of American history, and we're like, look, they used to wear things like that. Look at the you know, sword they used and the cannon, and here's this parchment that they used to write on. Okay, kids, let's go to the cafeteria. Time for lunch.
Yeah.
And it's this very cursory review of history, names, dates, facts, battles, blah 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 blah, blah, and all the superficial stuff drilled into them through rote memorization, without context, without modern connection or meaning or anything like that. Is it any wonder that kids like me come out of that system hating history, doing poorly at it, not understanding it at all? And so that to me is the biggest impediment towards us trying to create a freer society, is that our system, our educational system, is pumping out these kids with civic ignorance despite quote unquote graduating, and they're completely civically illiterate, historically illiterate. They don't at all have any, it's like a muscle that's atrophied. They've never flexed the muscle of learning from the past to extract those ideas from the past and apply them to the present and the future. Therefore, their muscle has atrophied, and they've not been taught at all to think of, why are the things that happened 250 years ago relevant at all to what happens today? We don't talk to them about history that way. We don't teach them that way. Can we really expect them to know different and to learn from history if we've never taught them that way? When we review all the social studies books, that's where they all fail. They're amazing at all the superficial factoids. They all do a piss poor job at talking about the ideas, the philosophy, the values, and how those things apply to our world today.
Yeah. No, I'm with you on that. Like, you know, and do people in positions of power want more competition? Like, no. If
Right.
there's a young kid who's like, I have this idea for the Jenkins twins, and you're like, damn, that's way better than what I'm doing. Like, are you going to want to empower them to go just like steal your market share? Like, of course not. Like,
Right.
so it makes sense that people don't want the best and brightest. I've taught in like East LA and like really bad areas of LA, and these kids were super geniuses, but no one's tapping into them. No one's giving them, you know, any kind of education, because the truth is these kids have been through stuff that they have more grit. If they're able to just run, they have more grit, and they will eat the lunch of I've also taught in like rich private schools. Those kids are going to positions of power, and they are ill-equipped. And we see now the people who are in charge of a lot of our institutions are not the best and brightest. And they probably know that. They know their kids are not the best and brightest. So they're going to do whatever they can to get their kids into the Ivy League schools and all that kind of stuff to try and give them a boost, which makes sense. I want best for my kid. Even if my kid's a dum-dum, I'm going to try and push them into a good high up position so they're successful. Shut down the kids who are probably more equipped to be there. And it all just kind of makes sense on the big spectrum. But I agree with you. I think when you do it as an individual, you don't see that. You just feel like, I'm just looking out for myself. I'm just trying to do what I'm doing. I'm just trying to survive and do my job. One of the things about free enterprise or knowing rights I want to go back to is I use this metaphor of like, if you you say that you've changed, you know, helped change laws and things like that. Like bureaucracy is crazy. I'm in California and I've tried to start businesses here. My wife runs a business here. It's really difficult. Lots of bureaucratic red tape. Some of that is necessary and some of it isn't. So I have an RV, and I was thinking like it's such a pain to like empty it out at one of these dump stations. Something. I was like, if there wasn't a law for this, I wouldn't. I hope not, but I think a lot of people just be like, I'm just going to dump this off into the woods. Whatever. And I guess it goes back to that how do you, if you want to empower young people to believe that they have more rights and to take more power away from central authority telling you what you can and can't do, how do you instill in them a sense of morality? Do you use like a religious framework? What do you use to help
Mm.
guide young people into this is the way you ought to act? Because a lot of things is like you can do this, but how should you be? How do you wrestle with
That's
that?
a that's a great question. Murray Rothbard has a great quote along these lines that I'm not even going to do justice to, so I won't attempt it. But the gist of what he's saying is that, you know, libertarianism and these Austrian economics, free market economics, they're not a moral framework. They describe what people shouldn't do to one another, not what they should do. So in a political context, we talk about something like the non-aggression principle, right? You should never aggress against someone else. It is always unjust for you to, you know, attack anyone else. That is kind of what the law ought to be. We shouldn't, you know, wage war on people. We shouldn't assault them. We shouldn't lock them in a cage for, you know, ingesting a substance you don't like. Like we should not have any aggression against anyone else. But that's in the negative, right? That's just saying don't do these things. It's not informing us on what we should do. We need to look for other sources, you know. And I'm a religious person. I have, you know, a moral code that I very much derive heavily from my religion. Um, and so then I look at something like the golden rule, right? So when we did our Tuttle Twins book, we wanted to talk about the non-aggression principle, um, because I think it's supremely important when it comes to political context. Because we, you know, even when you get to something like taxation, let alone foreign policy, you know, we were on roughshod over the non-aggression principle all the time as a government, because the government is very much violating our rights and being a bully. So we wanted to talk about the non-aggression principle. But again, to your point of like a kind of moral ethical framework, we didn't want to just leave kids with like, okay, so here's what not to do. And so our book is the Tuttle Twins and the Golden Rule. And we cast the non-aggression principle, the negative side of what not to do, through the positive lens of the Golden Rule to say, well, you should do things to other people that you want them to do unto you. And you know, every major religion talks about that. It's not just a Christian thing. And so that to me was a way to say, like, these things that we look at through a political or economic lens, we ought to and should, I think, also look at through the positive lens as well.
Yeah, and separate those kinds of elements. You know, like you had a tweet I think that was really good. It was something along the lines of it doesn't make you moral to advocate to have someone else pay for things or something along those lines. It was really
Yeah,
spot on. It's like the people this idea of I pay my taxes that makes me a moral person. Well, no. If someone puts a gun to your head literally and tells you to go, you know, help the homeless, when you lose that free will element of it, then how is that a moral thing? But it still gives you that feeling, and I think that that's part of what your books I probably do is they trigger people. They trigger people in they have to wrestle now with their preconceived ideas of them being a good person. And who wants to look at that? Who wants to say maybe I'm not as good of a person as I think I am? So I'm going to avoid this. That's what canceling is. That's
hmm
what blocking is. That's what a
right.
lot of the stuff that I confront because I'm an educator and I'm always trying to put stuff out there like on my Instagram and stuff that challenge people's thought. And a lot of people really push back on that. They feel like this is my identity you're attacking and they get
Right.
very, very aggressive. But at the very least, to wrestle with these things is an educational opportunity, even if the teacher doesn't agree to say, all right, let's read these books. What do you think? What do you think? And then, you know, even
And
being
that's the
able to
way it
like
ought
pick it
to
apart.
be.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the way it ought to be, because when you look at the root word for education, to educate, educare, when it's to educe, to extract something out, to draw it out, right? We so often think of education or schooling as cramming stuff in a child's mind. So my kids, I've homeschooled them their whole lives, or my wife frankly has. You know, in fact, it was John Taylor Gatto when I read Dumbing Us Down. My wife and I were engaged at the time, and I read it, and that book, gosh, man, it was like scripture to me. Like everything John talked about in that book about what's wrong with the structure of public schools spoke directly to me of what went wrong with me and why I bristled against, you know, schooling and why it was such a challenge for me. So I read this book and I'm like, oh my gosh, he wrote this book for me, you know. And so then I go down the rabbit hole and start learning a bunch more. I hand this book to my fiance at the time, and I was like, we got to homeschool our kids, you know, read this book. And so she did, and we did, and we've homeschooled them. They're now 13 and 11, my son and my daughter. Well, just last week, I put them in an Acton Academy, a private school that uses Socratic teaching. right? Because going back to this idea of schooling versus this educare or drawing out, I've been so impressed by these types of approaches. It's not unique to Acton, but they do it really well. And it's exactly what you just said. It's asking the kids, what do you think about it? Challenging them with these ethical questions, inviting them to kind of debate and to discuss and to test one another's ideas and see how strong they are. That is how we can create like robust understanding, is by evaluating these ideas rather than just absorbing through this authoritarian approach what is right and what the authority figure is telling you. So I applaud you for taking that approach, because it's so resonated with me as the right way to educate, not to bombard people with facts, but to challenge people with ideas and see what they think. Even if it's a 7-year-old who doesn't have well-formed thoughts, but they're going to hear their peer with another thought, it's going to help them refine their own thinking. And it's that constant friction process of ideas that's going to allow them and empower them to understand themselves more deeply and what they think, and develop that ethical framework of what they believe and why they believe it. Send them off to go read and go down these rabbit holes to go learn when they realize what their deficiencies are. And oh man, Susie like read that book and now she knows everything, I should go read that book too, right? That, like, it's such a winning approach, and it's so absent in our schools today. It's again that authoritarian approach that I think is a disservice to us as individuals. It is a service to authoritarian institutions like the government that want these rule followers. But if we want something different for our children, we got to act differently.
Absolutely. And then it helps them early on to confront opposing ideas. There's so many teachers that I'm like, hey, let's have a conversation. I've invited a lot of well-known teachers. I've had a couple of National Teachers of the Year on the podcast, and then I ask them some questions. They get freaked out, and then the CCSSO and NEA and stuff like that are like, we're not bringing anyone else on your podcast. Like, I'm asking them questions. I was told by some critical race theory teachers, high school teachers, that the Socratic method is toxic. It's like, this is John Haidt's book, The Coddling of the American Mind. It's like they just can't even bear it. Like, what is this alternative viewpoint? And if you start them off early, that an attack on your ideas, or even it's not even an attack, it's just thinking about your ideas is not an attack on you as it's not the same thing. But that's the way a lot of them take it. Something that I'd like to do on this podcast, because it's all about viewpoint diversity, cylinder. It's like, that's a circle. That's a rectangle. I love that stuff. But I see myself like, the people that agree to come on the show generally are people that are very open-minded and tend to be aligned with me a lot. So I try to present the other side a little bit. But what would you say would be the steel man? You've heard that term, as opposed to like straw man. So it's like,
right.
like the best arguments that you've been presented of people who have take issue with your work. What is like the best argument you can find of like, that makes you really think like, okay, they've got a point there about why what you're doing, the advocating for free market principles and stuff like that, would be, what kind of stuff gets you like, because we go, all right, that's a good point, I got to think about that one. Like, what would be a steel man argument against kind of the your work that you have to wrestle with?
Well, I'll answer it this way. One of our books, Elijah and I laughed that if anything was going to get us canceled or attacked or anything else, it was the Tuttle Twins and the Fate of the Future. So this was our 9th book in the series, and this book, all of these children's books are based off of original kind of classic ideas, right? The Road to Serfdom by Hayek, Economics in One Lesson by Hazlitt, The Law by Frederick Bastiat, and many others. This one was based off of Anatomy of the State by Murray Rothbard, wherein he describes how the state, not states like Texas or Utah or California, but the state, an abstract term designed to refer to a political institution that has a monopoly of force within a certain jurisdiction. So the state is your city, your county, your state. The federal government, it's just a type of political institution that's endemic to all of our different jurisdictions that we have. So he basically says that the state is an immoral, inherent evil for a variety of reasons, but fundamentally that we do not consent to it. It is this institution that does not have consent. You look at the Declaration of Independence that says, governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. And Rothbard's argument is that the state does not have our consent. I wrote a book for teenagers called Lessons from a Lemonade Stand, where I walk through all the forms of consent, and then we look at the state and we say, okay, have we consented to the state this way? Well, yes, maybe, no. Here's why. Here's some arguments. What about this, implicit consent? And, just because we haven't moved, right? You haven't left California. Does that mean you consent to everything that the California, government is doing? And you voted in the election. Yeah, sure, you voted for the
Yeah,
other guy, but you voted, you participated. Does
that's
that
what
mean that
people
you
say.
consent to?
Sorry, but that's what
Right.
people say is like,
So
well, just by being here, you can say. It's like, no, no, no. That's like saying just because you agreed to go on a date that you agreed to be raped. Like, no, no. That's like
exactly.
saying. So I was like,
Right. So in that book, we kind of challenge that. But when Elijah, to your point about the steelman
yeah,
argument, when Elijah and I were working on this book, that's when some of these arguments were in my head of like, are we pushing too radical of ideas into the minds of children? So the best argument I've heard against what we're doing is that we are sneakily trying to propagandize children with radical libertarian ideas, and what we're doing is disingenuous, that we are wrapping it in these flowery stories with marketing that's designed to allure people, draw them in, and then aha, we got you, we're now pushing anarcho-capitalism on 8-year-olds,
yeah,
and
yeah,
teaching
yeah.
them the evils of the state. And so, again, I feel like that's a weak argument for reasons I'll now explain, but of the strongest of the arguments we've had against our work, I feel like that's the strongest because there's an argument to be made there. Like, that is a radical idea. And to teach that to 8-year-olds, and, do their parents really understand that when they buy this book, that those are the ideas that they're, introducing to their children? Now, the rebuttal to that, I would say, is that ultimately these are not children's books. We thought when we started doing the Tuttle Twins that we were producing children's books. I mean, we are, and they are, but fundamentally, these are family educational resources. So almost universally, what's happening is that mom and dad are reading this together with their
Yeah,
children, and then they're talking about it, and we provide discussion questions at the end, and the families are. So what we're not doing is we are not giving a book like this one to a teacher and saying, hey, shut the door, and you get to capture the minds of those kids for 45 minutes, and their parents have no idea what you're talking about. Certainly that happens in school, and a lot of parents are fired up and they're going to school board meetings across the country precisely because they're worried about what's being put into their kids' minds from these activist teachers who see their calling, like John Dewey, as these kind of prophets of a generation serving what Dewey called the one true God. Dewey, by the way, was not Christian, right? He was an atheist, a secular humanist. For him, the one true God was government, and he literally called teachers the prophets of the one true God, right? And so there are teachers today who think like that, and they can propagandize the children in their classroom and mold them the way that they want because the door is closed and the parents don't know. That's not at all what we're doing. And so the rebuttal is that we're doing things eyes wide open. We're going into the front door. We're telling mom and dad, here you go. I mean, disagree with it you want, send the book back, we'll refund you, whatever. But better, if you don't agree with something in this book, talk to your kids about them and tell them why you think that. Challenge the idea. And I mean, this is where your podcast guests fail, right? When they are so brittle and weak that they can't withstand any scrutiny at all, and they don't want to debate and have their ideas challenged, so they just cancel and don't even want to join the discussion. So to parents, I say, that's great, disagree with this all you want. I embrace that, and that's going to be to the benefit of your children if you talk to them about why you think Connor was wrong in this book and give your kids more of this critical thinking skill. That's a huge plus, right, for your kids over the long term. And so that to me is the rebuttal. Is ultimately these are family resources. We're being very transparent about what we're teaching. Parents are talking about it with their kids so they can be that filter if they want in real time, rather than what's happening in schools. And so to the people who criticize me, I'm like, where's your criticism of what's happening in schools where there definitely is propaganda,
yeah,
the doors are
yeah.
closed and there's no transparency? Well, of course they agree with that type of propaganda, which is why they're not so, not applying the same standard to that as they do to us, which is why I feel ultimately it's a weak argument. But there's my answer to your question.
No, I appreciate that. And I I am highly critical of like Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo, but I'm okay with that being taught. At least, it's usually done in like professional development, as long as you also bring in whatever, like, James Lindsay or Douglas Murray or someone like that, like an alternative to it, Helen Pluckrose,
Right.
like someone, and then we can have a conversation. But yeah, if people have issue with your books, it's like, all right, well then you're going to get more solidified. You have to formulate some sort of argument about what you don't like about it, and that is a thinking process too. It's like I love being proven wrong because then I'm dispelling of a bad idea. So if they can come up with really good critiques of your book, it makes you, which it clearly does, is it makes you go, all right, well, we got to keep it on our radar and we got to be as good as we can. that's the competition. And when you shut it down, say people say cancel these books, get rid of them, then you're not going to address the very important ideas that are there, whether you agree with them or not. We're not supposed to all agree, but we're supposed to maybe understand one another, and then you form your arguments, and that's what education is all about. I think it's really awesome what you're doing, and your approach, just laying it out like that, Connor, I think is exactly what I'm advocating for every day. You know, if you don't like something, then just articulate why, have a conversation about it, and figure it out. Don't just shut it down, because it's not going to make it go away. These are fundamental principles that established our
Right.
nation. This is not going anywhere. You should probably know it.
Well, and for parents out there, do you want a child who can, critically think and evaluate different ideas and, test what they think, even what you as a parent are teaching your kids, right? Do we want children who are just kind of brainless automatons, or do we, I mean, every parent, of course, wants their kid to be well-rounded and critically thinking and stuff. And so the issue fundamentally is we have to be, I think, far more intentional about what we're exposing our children to, how we're parenting in the home, whether we send them to public school, private, homeschool, whatever. Like, we have to have eyes wide open about this stuff, recognizing that there are people out there who don't want our children to be critically thinking, who are okay with them to just absorb whatever they're told. And so if we don't want that outcome, then we have to make different choices. Or even if we, send them to public school and we know that their teachers are just doing a lousy job, fine. Like, if that's just your decision for whatever reason, I can respect it. But that means you have all the more work to do in the home to counteract, what's happening, and make sure you're all the more intentional about raising them the right way and exposing them to ideas and challenging what they, oh, I came home and I learned that we're, killing the earth and we need to recycle everything, and shame on us for throwing styrofoam in the garbage and it's like, okay, well, fine. Well, what's the counter idea to that? Maybe there's an opposing idea. And if we're not introducing that to our children, they're just going to turn into, social justice warriors because that's what their teachers told them to be. For me, ultimately, all of this, everything we're doing, everything that we're talking about on this episode of your podcast, all comes down to intentionality. We have to recognize that our children's minds are ground zero in an ideological battle where there are people vying for their attention and affection and loyalty, and they have their own motives, they have their own goals, desired outcomes. They, like Horace Mann, see our children as wax, to be manipulated in whatever direction they want them to be shaped into. And so if we don't recognize that there are forces out there that have those intentions and have those motivations, then we're allowing them to gain access to our children's hearts and minds without even being able to put up a defense, without even being able to kind of shield our children from that. So intentionality is the key. Taking that red pill, recognizing a lot of these forces and people are out there historically that have been there, and present day, surely they are as well. Again, we may sound like conspiracy theorists, but as you're just a good history teacher, if you recognize that this stuff has happened in the past and it's happening today.
Yeah. I think there is a resurgence of more libertarian ideas. I think it's COVID. I think it's a lot of things that are leading to that. So where can people follow your work? I mean, it's all over Amazon and stuff. Tuttle Twins. I think they're pretty popular. I see them. And my audience, I guess, also is fairly free market, libertarian left and right, which is interesting. A lot of libertarian people on the left. But they might already be familiar. But yeah, just how can we follow kind of what you're doing, support what you're doing, and get these books? Because I think, again, at the very least, even if you disagree with free market ideas, get the books, because then you have to wrestle with the ideas. Don't stay isolated in your bubble. Understand what it is. If you say you disagree with it, understand what it is that you say you're disagreeing with. And if you do agree with it, then awesome. Then you can kind of guide your kids thinking down a road that you would agree with, which is our right as parents to do. It's our job to raise our children. It's not the government's job. It's not the school's job to raise children. So where can people pick up your stuff?
Well, thank you. And I'll say briefly, I think it works both ways. We should read, Das Kapital by Marx, and we should read, all the critical race theory stuff, and whatever we object to, let's not reduce ourselves to the Fox News talking points about what people say is in it. Let's evaluate it, and let's kind of challenge our own thinking and understand it so that we can kind of speak better to it. For the Tuttle Twins books, I would encourage everyone to go to TuttleTwins.com, where you're going to get a far better deal than Amazon. We've got free workbooks that go with all of our books. And so we put together these big bundles to really create a lot of value for people. We've been talking about the American history problems with social studies books. We just came out with a brand new 240-page American history. I call it a quote unquote textbook. It's really just a big storybook talking about early American history, not just what happened, but the ideas that motivated all of those things, and then how those ideas relate to our modern world today. We've been working on this for 2 years, and it just launched. So we've got the book, we got curriculum, the audiobook, videos, this big bundle. That's at TuttleTwins.com/history. And then, we're all over YouTube and Instagram and Facebook, and even reluctantly on TikTok now. So we're we're on all the social media
Dumbing down society, right?
yeah, talk about, well, we got to educate the Chinese communists about freedom too. So we figure, well, we'll go on TikTok as well. So we're all over social media and sharing fun memes and behind the scenes stuff with what we're doing on Tuttle Twins. And so we're very easy to find, and grateful to you for sharing your platform here to talk about what we're doing, because I feel like it is so timely and critically important with the state of the world today. And we see parents really freaked out about, like, how do I talk to my kids about what's going on? And I don't even understand it. I went to public school. I wasn't, we get that a lot. Over half of our parents reading these books are like, I learned things that I'd never known before. So again, family resources, amazing elevated family discussions once you're kind of talking about these ideas and evaluating what that means for our world today. So TuttleTwins.com is where it's all at.
Cool. Connor, I know you're a busy guy. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about this. And I hope people, go out there, wrestle with what you're doing a little bit, and take it in, because it's important. I just love entrepreneurship too. So I admire you for seeing a problem and saying, all right, well, you look left, you look right, no one's doing it, I guess I'm doing it. And I think that's how a lot of good things happen in society. So I really appreciate you giving me your time, and thank you for coming on, man.
Thank you, Will. Appreciate it.